So we looked at politeness a little bit already, even the previous talk, which was very nice. And I thought about this, why aren't we always direct? Why do we do things, in the way we do? And I think part of it is because politeness is selfish. It's strategic. And I think as humans, we have this reciprocity instinct. We have this sense of fairness. We like this idea of social exchange. And George Holman said that we think of behavior all the time as social exchange, except for when we write sociology. And that's something that really sticks with me. Another thing is that reputation is valuable. And this is especially valuable to our relationships. So we can't just say things as if it were just a one-time deal. The last thing that really I think drives politeness through is not just that we have this fairness instinct, but we also know others do. Okay, and this idea of a theory of mind is something that I think allows language itself to work. Okay. Now, what is game theory? Well, it's a mathematical formalism. It's focused on strategy, and it has applications in economics, biology, social sciences. It's been really much the subject of a lot of recent inquiry into its applications in language and communication. And Van Roy, with whom I've had a lot of nice discussions, treated politeness as something like the peacock's tail, as a showy signal used to gain entry into social groups where there were misaligned preferences. I don't think that's the whole story, and we can talk about that later in the discussion if you're interested in that. Pinker, Novak, and Lee also looked at indirect speech game theoretically. So I want to maybe go into how we can look at politeness in a similar way. As you've seen in these other talks, that humans have these basic needs of autonomy and acceptance. And the problem with a lot of interactions is that they can be face-threatening, that they can violate our need for acceptance or autonomy. So a lot of speakers may weigh this potential face threat versus how important the interaction is. Brown and Levinson have this tree of strategic speech, and what I want to look at is these highlighted branches here. Okay? So we'll focus a little bit on what Pinker said with indirect speech acts, but in general, I want to think about what happens when we have to be direct, but we don't want to hurt the relationship. Okay? I think that's a source of politeness. Now, Pinker, Novak, and Lee said that one reason for indirect speech is plausible deniability. The idea is that if there's a potential face threat, we may choose to be indirect. And the idea is that indirect speech changes the game in some way. It gives us an extra option. Let's think about that a little later. Now, another reason for indirect speech is that we have to negotiate relationships. So there are three canonical relationship types. These are dominance, communality, and reciprocity. And the problem is that cooperation in each type is a little different, and it's fragile. The type of behavior that's appropriate in one type of relationship is not necessarily appropriate in the other. So the last thing here is that language can be thought of as a digital or discrete medium. And when we speak directly, there's a certainty to what we say that can be transmitted across our social network. Okay? Indirect reciprocity, the type that we use a lot of times in communication, requires a name. And so things get attached to our name, and if they can be spread around a community, then that can really hurt us. Okay? And that connects with this idea that speech is performative. We all read lines. We all act a part. No matter what your occupation is, everyone's in showbiz. Okay? The Kinks said that, not me. All right? And this connects with this idea of a digital medium, connects this idea that when something is common knowledge, as opposed to just everyone in a group knowing it, it's more readily transmittable across a social network. So let's dive in a little bit more into what game theory is all about. And I'm going to present you with an example on coffee. We're at an academic conference, so people like coffee. Okay, let's say you're at a coffee stand and they have an honor system. Now what you could do is you could put your coins in the cup. We'll call that action C, or you could deceive the seller. He could give you real coffee, or he could give you dirty water. All right. Now the two of you will be seen by no one, and you will never see each other again. The question is, what will you do? And what will he do? Okay? Now, we're going to play this game, and since it's the honor system, and no one will see each other again, in just a second, I'm going to ask everyone to close their eyes. Okay? I'm going to count to 3. You're going to close your eyes. All right? You ready for it? All right, and then you're going to raise your hand based on what you would do. Okay? Just close your eyes. 1, 2, 3. If you would put coins in the cup, raise your hand. Okay? Put those hands down. If you would deceive the seller, raise your hand. Okay? Put those hands down. All right? Now, keep your eyes closed and pretend you're the seller. If you would put real coffee in the cup, raise your hand. All right? Put your hands down. And if you would put dirty water in the cup, raise your hand. Okay? Put those hands down. All right. Everyone go open their eyes again. Strangely enough, I think we have a group of very ethical people here. Well, this also tells us that we don't have a group of economists here. All right? Because actually what I saw is that 90% of the folks raised their hand. Well, guess what? If you did that, you will come out behind. Remember, we're not going to see each other again. Okay? And so this example here is called the prisoner's dilemma. In fact, it was invented as a challenge to game theory, as a challenge to rationality. All right? Despite the setup of the game, I have a feeling that a lot of you have this reputation instinct so firmly ingrained that you said, well, no, I'm not going to cheat the guy. Okay? And yet the rational thing for the coffee seller and for the customer are both to cheat each other. Okay? We can look at the payoffs here. So you think about the coffee, right? If I pay $1 for the coffee and he gives me the coffee, right? We're both, this is what we expected, right? But let's think about, and just to think about this here, what's happening. We'll move over here. I'm going to put myself in the first slot. So the first number is mine, and the second number is the coffee guy's. If I get the coffee, right? So he put the real coffee in there. I get a coffee. I didn't give him any money, and he lost the coffee, right? That's really not in his interest. Okay? And likewise, if I put the coins in the cup and I get the dirty water, not only have I lost money, but I also got this dirty water. It's no good, right? Strangely enough, the incentives of this interaction might push us towards this outcome, okay? To where we both defect on each other, to where I put, some kind of deceptive coin in there, okay, and where he puts dirty water in the cup. Strangely enough, as we just saw with this survey, and now I will say this, with economists, they will typically raise their hand on the cheating part, and then when everyone opens their eyes, they'll put it back down. Okay? And the reason for that is this idea of reputation is valuable. But why do I talk about this example? Well, there's this idea that I would say that politeness follows kind of a similar paradigm. It's that we all have an interest as a society to use something like politeness, and yet on a one-shot interaction, it doesn't make much sense. But it stays in place. And the same type of mechanisms that hold cooperation in play in an economic scenario, I would claim hold politeness in a linguistic scenario. These are ideas of repeated interaction and of reputation. Okay? And right here we see the prisoner's dilemma, and we just went through what we call an equilibrium, what will shake out in the end. Okay? Now there's some evolutionary roots that connect cooperation and conflict. One thing here that I want to point out is that relationships exist outside of language. We can cooperate without even rationality. We can coordinate with just bare signals, not necessarily compositionality. Reputation and repetition are important. Cooperation can turn into coordination. So where the incentives are no longer so perverse to make us at each other's throats, but rather to make us want to do the same kinds of things. Another thing here is that I would say that face is a public good. It's in all of our interests to maintain face. Strangely enough, what's the classical public goods game? It's the prisoner's dilemma, the one that we just saw. So when we think about information versus relationships, sometimes we have to ask, is there real conflict? Is it that they both add up to some finite amount, like information plus relationships is 1? Or is it that we can both gauge them independently? I would tend to go with the second one. Because if the first one was the case, I think we would only have indirect speech and direct speech. The problem is sometimes relationships are important and the information is important. So we see something like politeness. Because we have to communicate, this is really important, but I don't want to change the relationship we're in because I think that's valuable too. Other thing is that scarcity requires strategy. So we don't have unlimited resources. We don't have unlimited information. So we have to work together sometimes, and sometimes we have to work against each other because of these limited resources. Okay? This idea of strategy, I think, is important when we make a request because we need to make requests to get others to help us. And yet there's this kind of feeling of loss of control when we make that request because we're no longer in charge of the situation. So we have to rely on someone else. Okay? So I think now, all right, so what aspects of requests are amenable to game theory? Well, one thing might be where we have semantic overlap but pragmatic distinction. So we'll get into the real language now. I think of something like, would you open the door? Okay, a pretty common request. Then I think about, would you marry me? All right, it sounds a little funny, all right, and let's examine why that is. So I think about saving face, and I think about saving the date, all right? When you get these cards that say save the date, all right, someone's getting married. There's will you marry me versus will you open the door, okay? I might say will you open the door is a little bit funny, okay, but will you marry me sounds pretty natural. And parallel to that too, would you marry me versus would you open the door, okay? Let's take a look at why these might be funny, all right? Now this kind of pattern is seen across languages, and I'm sure there are other languages that some of you know in here where you see this pattern. There is strangely a link between desire and action because even in German you say, willst du mich heiraten? And this is more like, do you want to marry me? And I think it's the same in French. So it is a little funny there. Okay? Let's think about just opening the door. There's a chance I might get rejected, right? And the information is not super important. I mean, I could probably open the door myself, or I could get someone else to open the door. So there's kind of this idea that I want to recognize your autonomy first because the information is not as important as the relationship. Okay? The way that I do that is that this would you open the door elicits some kind of possible world semantics where I know that there are many occasions in which maybe you couldn't open the door, okay, and I want to recognize that. Will you open the door is very direct. It implies that I really need to do it right now. So you could see this if it's necessary, okay? What about would you marry me? Okay, and I think of in the Meatloaf song where the woman says, I gotta know right now, okay? So this idea of marrying me is a little bit funny. Do I want to give someone possible worlds with the would? Well, I would marry you, but your apartment's so dirty, okay? Or if you are rich and handsome, okay? Whereas will you marry me, there are only two options here, okay? In this case, you might say the information is even more important than the relationship because you still want a yes or no, okay? Now how can we model that game theoretically? Well, think about Sam is going to make a request of Robin by choosing a message based on his belief of success. Notice these are gender-neutral names, so it could be, anybody, but we'll call Sam him, all right? What I want to say here is that the utility that they'll experience is a function of the payoffs in this game I'm about to show you called the marriage game. So there's a value of coordination, and then there's a time investment, and there's a certainty imposed by the request, okay? On the left, we have just a degenerate coordination game. The idea is that, there's an action they can take or they can not take the action. In this case, it just seems smart to just take the action. But what this can turn into over time is what I'm calling the marriage game. So the idea is that we're investing time in somebody. And we have a very strong dispreference for unaligned actions. In other words, if Sam if Sam does not want to marry, but Robin does, right? Robin has put in this time here, okay? And Robin will experience some kind of loss of utility, all right? Same for Sam in the other case. When I think about utility, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the utility of a player based on our response is just, the utility in the game times a certainty. Okay, we'll see that in a second. This expected utility equation I've written here is just a weighted average, just the way you would calculate your students' grades. Okay. What asking, will you marry me versus would you marry me can do is it adds an extra strategy to the game. Okay. There's really no difference between asking, will you marry me and would you marry me, except that would reduces the risk on the part of both players. By reducing the risk, what I also mean here is that we're reducing both payoffs and punishments here. Okay, so this R here is just a value that's less than 1. All right. So will and would are not really any different. If you set 1, if you set R to 1, then you would have will. Okay, that's what I'm playing here. What's nice about this is what shakes out. Okay. And this is real similar to what Pinker did with his analysis of indirect speech. What's nice about this is what shakes out. So what you see is that if you have this, let me go back. What you see, when you think about this R value, if you keep it fixed, is that we can think about when is would irrational. Well, it's when the probability of yes times the value of the interaction is less than that time investment. Okay, this shouldn't surprise us. Okay, so what this means is if I don't think they'll say yes, or it's not a very valuable interaction, I'll probably say would. Okay. The idea is that would minimizes this loss I could experience. When would I say will? Well, it's when I either am very certain that they'll say yes, or it's a very valuable piece of information to have, like marriage. Okay? Very important. What's also interesting is, why do we have both? Well, we have diversity of relationships, right? So it's not that I would need to ask people the same type of question in every situation. If I have diversity of relationships, I need to maintain a way of signaling either type. What about for Robin? Well, what's interesting for Robin is, when does she want will? She wants will when the value of the interaction is greater than her time investment. The probability is all up to her. So she knows, she has no uncertainty about her state. Okay? So think about this, to make you think back about the question, why would you say, will you marry me over would you marry me? Well, it's not only that I want to know the information very badly, but when she responds, she wants to know for certain that we're both committed to this action. Okay? So I got a few claims here based on this, and let's go through them real quick and then we'll wrap up. The first is that just as reciprocity gives way to coordination in repeated economic exchanges, so does language favor reducing ambiguity when knowing someone for a long time. The second is, if I only have a one-shot scenario, this is a strange prediction that came out, directness emerges as a rational strategy. If I'm in a crowded bar and I'll never see the girl again, maybe I can just say, hey, will you marry me? Okay? Why not? All right, there's no time investment, so it doesn't matter. Third, in contrast to Pinker, Novak, and Lee, a request allowing the listener autonomy is not always a rational strategy, especially when that information is very important to both of them. A big question is, does this will-would have other parallels? And I'm really interested in this idea in Spanish where this formal form of address is dying out, because I think that's the next thing that seems natural for this type of analysis. Okay? Last, I'd like to thank you.
We have about 6 minutes for questions.
I have a more specific comment and a more general one. Thanks for the explanation of how this works in game theory. It's very succinctly put. I enjoyed that. I'm wondering about the subjunctive will-would. And I think you gave us a very nice semantically motivated interpretation of how it would work. If these things existed in a vacuum, they do not exist in a historical vacuum. So the prediction from this should be that in any language that has a subjunctive, these things work the same way, and we know that they don't. And part of the reason is because of the contrasts in the Saussurean sense of value, where everything's a system, and depending on the available options, the semantic space of different moods, for instance, will expand or contract depending on what other moods are available, which is something that changes diachronically as well. So you hinted at that yourself when you said, well, in French, actually, the conventionalized question, way to ask someone to marry you or someone, is by asking about desire. So I would say that with the marriage question, you have quite an institutionalized, famous kind of passion that tends to get repeated in the same way. So even though the will-would works in that case, it's not all that's going on. And so game theory would give us that if this was the first use of these expressions. Mm-hmm. But I think part of the reason the intuitions work that way is because it's a post-facto rationalization of, but it's not why it happened in the first place. There's also historical reasons that give this result in English, and it's because of these historical reasons that we don't get similar results in all languages that have an indicative subjunctive contrast. That's one comment which I think I don't know, I mean, it doesn't necessarily challenge what you're saying, it's just saying that game theory won't work when you have this social context rather than a social vacuum. It's not all, there's more to it. The second comment would be, it seems to me that it's the more general question of how would a model like this deal with things like positive politeness, the kinds of compliments, for instance, in Spanish that Maria was talking about yesterday, where, and I think you may have thought about this a little bit, I understand, where you're not obviously, so I was glad that you later specified it to requests. How would game theory work with requests? But if you think about unsolicited acts of goodwill that we seem to be doing just because we feel like it. And of course we know that some are more frequent in some cultures compared to others, but so this theory seems to have built into it the hierarchy between negative phase and avoidance being more important than positive phase and approval. And we know that cross-culturally, sometimes approval is more important than autonomy, and that was something that came out in a different paper yesterday, where autonomy was violated for the sake of building a positive relationship. So, and I'm not sure how game theory would deal with that possibility of where there isn't a cost to self in that sense, or to other. There is no phase thread built into the act. Gratuity politeness, you might call it.
Yeah. Well, one thing that's nice about game theory is that it is amenable to social networks. So I can think about that, within a society I have different kinds of relationships, okay? That's one. Also, this idea of autonomy versus affiliation, you could think about, okay, well, within the social network, I have a certain payoff in coordinated actions, right? And those are the type of actions that really would require affiliation, okay? I also have a payoff in being able to choose what actions I can do. So I think it is amenable to both, and I think this idea of this positive face is getting more towards what I said as face as a public good. So it's like we're paying money to enter the game. Okay, and I think this is pretty naturally amenable, but this is definitely something I'm working on right now. So, okay, we can go Betty and then Robert. Okay.
This is just quick. When you had us all close our eyes and raise our hands, what I was thinking is, from a game theoretic point of view, why on earth, you as a rational actor, given that all our eyes were closed, why would you tell us the truth about our responses?
Says he did.
all game theory is conflict, right? A lot of it's coordination too. And in fact, we have interest in being coordinated. So yeah, but I did that to kind of gauge the room's interest in reputation and versus strict rationality.
Yeah, I know this has to be quick because we're pretty much out of time, but your answer to Marina's question made me think more and more about why Marina didn't ask in these terms, because we talked about it all last night, right? The relationship between game theory and Borgesian theory, right? Right, Marina? I mean, so I think this would be a nice direction for you to continue into the future with this research, because the whole idea of how you answer her question about how this is an economic thing, you're actually paying for it. You're describing symbolic capital in the market economy of language, and so I think it would be really neat to see what the confluence between game theoretical linguistics and Borgesian sociolinguistics might bring you to. They might complement each other, and they might bring out some differential ways to describe the same thing, which would be positive for you.
Yes.
I think in modern English anyway, it's not limited to just this question use though, because I get the feeling, I mean, I don't know what other intuitions are, but I think like if you've offered a student one to come to school here, you say, will you come, as opposed to would you, I think it's more natural. So I'm just saying I don't think it's localized to this one example of marriage.
All right. I
So
think
you
it's
might be
a
able
more.
to, like,
Yeah, I think it's a more general thing. It's kind of why I was saying that notice once again, this question, this will you come, in some ways is about the relationship of the university and the student, right? And it's something you really need to know. That information is very important. So when information is important, typically we're gonna speak more directly.
Well, maybe there's two different slightly, I mean, given Laura's example, there's slightly two different speech acts going on. One's more like an invitation. So with would you open the door, there is the question, it's a request, and it's not clear that the listener benefits from that. With would you marry me, it's almost creates an expectation that only the speaker benefits from that, and maybe that's why it's inappropriate. So maybe there's slightly different.
But also offering food, you don't usually say like, will you have another?
That's what I mean.
Would you?
That's what I
Which is a
mean.
little
That's
off.
more like an offer invitation kind of thing compared to the would you, which seems to have more. That's exactly what I'm saying. Will you is maybe more.
Will elicits is common knowledge, and I mean logicians or economists have shown
So
that
they're not both
common knowledge is necessary for collaborative action, for group action. So I think that's what we're really dealing with, is commitment, okay, and common knowledge and how they interact. So, yeah. All right, thanks.
Produced by OCE Atlas Digital Media at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign.